Thanks, Lloyd, and thank you very much for inviting me to do this presentation. I'm just going to give a very short talk, and maybe I should start by saying, I'm one of the few historians who enjoy studying the history of medicine. As the COVID-19 outbreak already tell us, it is when there is illness, and when there's illness on a large scale, that a lot of history begins. So I'm going to talk about tuberculosis today, and as a way of also saying, how we can and we should actually bring the study of disease into the study of history. The study of any history will be incomplete without looking at the various diseases that happen in any society. Let me just switch to the slides. Yeah. Okay, so I'm just going to talk about tuberculosis today in particular, because that was a recent book that I did with an infectious disease physician, Shu Liang, who is actually also an expert one of the experts on COVID-19. There are a few major things that I want to go through in terms of how teachers can sort of introduce the teaching of TB in the history syllabus for lower secondary Singapore history. The history of tuberculosis in colonial Singapore is definitely connected to some of the concepts and some of the issues that you'll be raising in the history curriculum. As I said earlier, disease is a part of Singapore history that we cannot ignore. Both the outbreaks themselves and the way that the government and the community respond to the outbreak. It is part of the history of Singapore as a port city, and I think some of you are interested in how TB can kind of provide insights into the history of Singapore. In that role, I prefer to see history. I prefer to see Singapore as a city-state, but I think there's an overlap between the two. In both cases, you have got a relatively open port city or a city that brings in disease together with people and trade and business. However, TB is not just a history of port or the economy or trade, but it's also very much a people's history. So in that sense, it's very apt for teaching about people's experiences in colonial Singapore. And finally, I'll talk about some of the sources we can use. What are some of the findings? So I basically will break up the history of tuberculosis in colonial Singapore before the Second World War into two periods. These are two periods that you're all familiar with. One would be the period where Singapore was ruled from India, from 1819 till 67. And the other one would be after 67, when we are directly ruled from the colonial office. So we are looking at a very long history of TB. TB is very well known among the older Singaporeans as something that happened after the Second World War, where, people were coughing out blood, and, we know about SATA, we know about the X-rays, BCG, and all those things. But actually, TB had a long history beginning from 1819, from the early beginnings of Singapore, really. Most of the early period was talk only. It's mainly not so much a policy. There was really no policy, and the British were very unwilling to implement a policy. But the talk itself is historically significant. And also in terms of causation, how TB became such a serious illness in colonial Singapore, that has got very much to do with the sort of the economy and the economic factors that gave rise to the housing and the housing environment where people lived. The other issue, which is also an issue very common in the history of medicine, is the racial aspect, and it's very common in places where you have got a colonial power ruling over a very different ethnic group, where race comes into the picture. When you see large numbers of people falling sick to a disease, it's very tempting, especially if these people are of a different ethnicity or a different group of subjects from yourselves, to make generalizations about them, okay, which we are actually seeing with COVID-19 these days as well. I said earlier that there's a people's history, there's a social history of TB. So there are lots of different subgroups that we can look at in the history of TB, from the paupers in the beginning, immigrants, especially coolie immigrants, working class immigrants from China, people who live in the kampongs and shop houses. We also look at certain demographic groups. Infants and children became very important after the war. The elderly people are very important today. It is the most high-risk group for TB. Migrant workers are also very important today, but throughout most of Singapore's history, migrant workers, nearly everyone was a migrant worker in a sense. And social history also involves SATA, which was the Singapore Anti-Tuberculosis Association formed in 1949, which was an NGO formed by doctors and professionals and businessmen. So the other thing is, as we also know with COVID-19, TB is not just about the sick. It's also about managing, persuading, vaccinating people who are healthy or people who are vulnerable. So in that sense, you have a very wide social history beyond the small numbers who are actually sick. TB is not just about drugs. It's not just about antibiotics. Although the antibiotics were very effective, it's not just about the doctor's efforts or the medical establishment or hospitals, but it's also a disease that happened and was controlled in the homes, schools, rural area, and even in culture. So there's a cultural aspect, like with publicity and exhibitions, where anti-TB efforts. So obviously, all these things are kind of familiar to us today. Living in the situation that we have today. So the kind of restrictions that we have are not really unique or exceptional in history. Throughout the course of medical history, we've had disease control come into our homes, our communities, besides the hospitals.